Hello, and welcome to this episode of Such a Nightmare Conversations about Horror. I am Katherine Troyer, and I get to be joined once again by Toni Tresca.
Hey there.
This is a podcast where the horrifically nerdy meets the terrifyingly academic as we explore that fine line between the horrific and the horrible. Each episode looks at a specific horror text that is for better or worse, giving us nightmares.
We are so excited to have you join us today for our conversation about 2021's Willy's Wonderland.
This is the third text in our sort of horror amusement park series. It's not quite an amusement park, but we started with Disneyland, and for all that it wasn't called Disneyland, and then we moved to Five Nights at Freddy, and then this film, which feels like another version of Five Nights at Freddy.
Yeah, very, very similar. Although I guess the writer of the film, Geo Parsons, does technically claim that this is based off of the short film that they made in 2015, 2016. It's clearly inspired by the 2014 Five Nights at Freddy's video game. And,
Yeah.
it's much better than the Five Nights at Freddy's official movie. I'll say that.
Yes,
I can
yes.
confidently go on record.
And I think it's because, and we've talked about this before, not just about Five Nights, but with other stuff that when you're not sure who your intended audience is, right? Is it supposed to be little kids who are having a good time or adults who've grown up with this text? It is near impossible to have an effective horror movie. Whereas I think Willy's Wonderland had a really clear audience. I'm not sure who those people are, but there was a clear demographic in mind. And I think that has inspired a cult following that I may not entirely understand, but can respect, I think.
Absolutely. It's pretty weird. I mean, it's pretty weird and wild. The animatronics look pretty good. And I guess before we dive in, I guess I give a little bit of
Yeah.
a little bit of a brief overview. We start in a cold open, our least favorite cinematic trope.
Yes.
In which we watch two dweebs get murdered by these animatronics. And then we jump cut to Nick Cage, silent, a guy with incredible beard in this movie, in a Camaro driving around, but then all of a sudden, dun dun dun, flat tire. He is caught in the small town of Hayesville, North Carolina, picked up by this mechanic, Jed Love, who then takes him to Willy's Wonderland, which is this creepy, abandoned Chuck E. Cheese looking knockoff, where he talks to this wacky owner, Tex McAdoo, who offers him the job, which is a great name, by the way.
Yeah, it is.
Who offers him the job as his night shift janitor, and then locks him in the building with where all of these puppets proceed to come to life. Well, I guess not puppets, animatronics.
Yes.
They're kind of puppet feet too in design, particularly in this flick, I think. And then in the background, there's all these teen characters who are running amok, who have their own personal vendettas against this Willy's Wonderland establishment. Shenanigans ensue. So much blood is spilled, both animatronic and human. And yeah, that's pretty much this spoiler-free version of Willy's Wonderland, as spoiler-free as you can get in a movie that really goes pretty much exactly as you expect.
Yeah, I was gonna say I'm not sure there's many things that are to be spoiled. So I knew that this film was gonna be a trip. The moment that we got to the first of many shots of Nick Cage riding around in his Camaro, because the camera work is so stylized and it is so intense that you just know this is going to be a film that has a clear vision. Again, maybe not one I always understand, but it definitely has a clear vision. But at the same time, so to your point that it was a spoiler-free sort of summary, it's partly spoiler-free because in many ways this film does not do the things that you were told you should do when writing a story, right? There's not a very clear causal relationship of this happens, therefore, of course, this happens. I often think about the fact that one of the best texts I ever read that was talking about how to create a good narrative structure said, that you have to have something that forces a character to go across the threshold from act 1 to 2, right? There has to be something that propels them. And that's particularly important, I think, in horror, because often you're like, why don't you just leave the haunted house, right?
Mhm.
But there is so much about this film, like, why is he cleaning anyway, right? Like, why is
Yeah.
this teenage girl so obsessed with helping him, despite the fact that she has clearly not bothered to help the many other people beforehand? Why is it that the one couple, despite the fact that they know that this is literally a place with evil animatronics, just have to have sex anyway? Like, it's not even one of those cases where you can be like, oh, well, they didn't know better. They literally could not have known better, more better. And so the framework I decided for scholarship, that the only way I could reconcile this is to think about it through the carnivalesque.
Yeah, I think that's probably a pretty good way to frame it. We've talked about the carnivalesque on this pod before, in a couple
Yeah.
other episodes. So which author are you bringing in this time?
Yes. So I'm bringing in the grandpapa of talking about the carnivalesque, and that's Mikhail Bakhtin, who was a Russian theorist. And he basically was a medieval scholar who said, like, isn't it interesting how there are these periods where they suspended all the rules and then they just lived this really weird thing. And the best example of like what that actually looked like in practice is probably Disney's The Hunchback of Notre Dame, right? Wherein Quasimodo becomes king for a day, and everyone's all
Mm,
excited about it because like he's so hideous that it's amazing. But then of course, once they realize he's actually hideous, it's no longer cool and fun. And so the Carnivalesque was just about the suspension of that. It was a very ritualistic experience. It was a pageant in every way that a pageant can happen. And it was life is this is a quote from Bakhtin, life is drawn out of its usual rut. It is to some extent life turned inside out, the reverse side of the world. And we've talked about this before, but Bakhtin talks about things like carnivalesque laughter, which is this weird ambivalent thing where you're like laughing both because something's funny, but also because it's not funny. There is a lot about, again, the sort of like attitude that everything gets to be sort of suspended, and the sacred and the profane are linked together, and the lofty and the low and the great and the insignificant and the wise but the stupid. So it's just this period of time where everything that we have accepted as being the status quo in the quote real world gets to be suspended for this period of time. And it is probably the only way that I can make sense of this movie, because none of it really makes sense from a like, why would they do this sort of perspective.
that's a really intriguing introduction because the only other like framework that I was thinking about coming into it with was kind of like intentional camp. It feels a little, and I only
Yeah.
say that particularly after I read this fantastic interview that Claire Cullis did for Entertainment Weekly titled Nick Cage is into reptiles, the insane behind the scenes stories of Willy's Wonderland. And I won't make you wait to know what that title is
Yeah,
referring to.
please,
It
please.
was apparently, so in the original draft of the script, most of the characters were mammals, but because Nicolas Cage is so into amphibians and dinosaurs, he was like, let's make this into an alligator, let's make this into a chameleon, let's get a turtle instead of a regular mammal.
That's
That's
amazing.
according to the writer Parsons. But the only reason I say that is because they acknowledge all of these elements that you're talking about. These kind of Nick Cage's the janitor is cleaning these things despite everything, and they're like, most people would kind of look at that and be like, that's dumb, it doesn't make any sense or whatever. But they're like, we knew we had the right actor because Nick Cage came in and he was just like, this movie has to be made exactly like this. This is perfect. And so it feels very intentionally high camp in that
Yes.
regard.
And I
Um,
think there's a huge relationship between camp and the carnivalesque, right? Especially
Absolutely.
when we
Absolutely.
think about like and we've talked about this in some of our Friday the 13th episodes, right? When you think about actual camps, right, as being this weird place out in the middle of nowhere where like things that you would never do in the real world happen. And then of course thinking about, Sontag's version of camp, but like it all I think ties together. And I'm glad I want to focus on Nick Cage for a second, because the Bakhtin talks about the fact that one of the big primary carnivalistic acts is the mock crowning and then decrowning of the carnival king, and that's like a huge big part of it. And I have always been personally a huge fan of Nicolas Cage. I know that
Hmm.
for a while it wasn't cool to think he was good, but I've liked him since some admittedly horribly fantastic 90s movies, including one of my favorites, Face Off, which is
Yes.
just such a good movie that if we're going to talk about plots that don't quite make sense is a great example. But even like Con Air, like I've been here for Nicolas Cage sort of from the start of my childhood, and I think that we couldn't have had another actor because he somehow managed to play this role so seriously, so straight. But he also, like, there would be moments where you knew that even he had to let some of the absurdity permeate through the janitor character, but it was never in a way that felt like he was mocking the
Hmm.
situation or mocking the audience for watching this. And that is not an easy feat, considering that all he does is play pinball, kill some animatronics, and clean and drink some energy
And
drink.
drink the drink, and then
Yeah.
you forgot he dances while playing
Oh,
pinball
that's
at the end.
true. That is true. I did forget about that, which was actually like a rather delightful scene because again, he managed to pull it off in a way that I'm not sure anyone else could have because you weren't because it felt ironic and unironic at the same time, which is
I
just amazing.
this probably will not surprise you, but they also, the writer and directors, and I don't know if I've said the director's name yet, so I'll go ahead and say that here. It's Kevin Lewis. They both revealed that that's not in the script. That was Nicolas Cage's idea. He came up with it, and they were both super complimentary to him and his performance, and just being like, yeah, he really came in and elevated the material. It's like he's working. We were really lucky to be working with a professional like that. And I
Yeah.
think that makes it. And the role was written for him in mind, and luckily they had a connection who was able to get this in front of his agent. And within 48 hours of him reading the script, he signed on. This was. I mean, and this does feel like it does feel like if you're gonna make this movie, you kind of have to get Nick Cage.
Yeah, you do. And I think you can tell that this role was written for him. And also, this movie wouldn't have been worth watching at all if he hadn't been in it. And I'm not sure that this is
Hmm.
a film that I will necessarily watch again. So that's my like bar. Like I'm not sure I will experience this again, but I'm not sure I could have experienced it without him in the role.
And then I want to also, before we get into some of the more critical aspects of the film, I suppose, is I do also want to shout out the character work. The character design for all of these animatronics is all super cool. They put
Yes.
people in these suits. You can clearly tell, and it looks so much better than the like shitty character designs from Five Nights at Freddy's, where they look so CGI, just like so. I just want to really shout that out. They got all stunt doubles, stunt people who were in there,
Yes.
and you really felt that it makes a difference. It makes those fight sequences with Nick Cage just a whole lot more visceral, and
Yes.
it does again. Like I think I probably come down closer to you as well. I don't think I will be revisiting the flick, but
Mhm.
but those sequences do make the film kind of very a breezy watch.
Yes. And I haven't been able to say this for everything we've watched. I wasn't bored, right? I was sometimes
Correct.
confused, but I was never bored. And I think you're absolutely correct. We do have to acknowledge that this film is relying on the uncanniness of things like Chuck E. Cheese, right? Which were never
Hmm.
CGI'd. And of that, like, is it a human or is it not? And it's like, well, yes, technically it is a human, but also it's not because that's not what you're seeing. And that was just lost in Five Nights at Freddy's. And
It,
really anytime a film forgets that like low tech is all that is needed to create that sense of unease.
yeah, like I really enjoyed the gorilla bathroom fight scene. I thought
Mm-hmm.
that was a particular high point of the film, both in like in terms of blocking, in terms of I mean Nick Cage's performance in that scene just absolutely sells
Yes.
it. In addition to that creepy monkey voice and everything, and then gets slammed into all the bathroom stuff in there, breaks the
Yes.
mirror and everything. It looked really good. Those
Yes.
moments were really really tight. And yeah, I'll end on that before
And
and
there's
let you.
the
Yeah.
ball pit scene too, right?
Mhm.
So there's I think just
And
several moments where they really capitalized on what are the places that in an already creepy place has the potential to be more creepy, and it's going to be the bathroom, right? It's going
Hmm.
to be the ball pit. It's going to be the kitchen area. I think
Hmm.
they just really understood in a way that the film Five Nights at Freddy did not, but I think the game obviously did. What is
Hmm.
so disturbing about being in this space at liminal times, right?
Yeah, and yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it. And I think that's what also really works about that final battle confrontation between the janitor and Willy in
Yes.
the big ballroom. There is just something super uncanny about a place that's supposed to be safe for children being totally decimated by these
Yes.
figures that are in theory, if Willy is supposed to be this safe weasel thing that you see lit up with rainbows on the
Yeah.
outside. And so I think it really did manage to capture that in a very effective way.
I also thought the backstory wasn't bad, especially again compared to Five Nights. The
Yeah.
sort of motivation for the town and why they were doing it, why they were all in on it. We didn't need much, right? Because again, we sort of suspended our disbelief extravagantly the moment the film started. But I think it did do a good job. And again, I appreciated not trying to make a backstory that felt like I needed to care or be empathetic towards people, and
Mhm.
that's what the film should have done.
Yeah, I think it definitely also works. This film works a lot better than Five Nights at Freddy's because it doesn't attempt to straddle the line between like, oh, it's very real. This is all no supernatural stuff. Oh no,
Yeah.
ghost kids or whatever. This is
Yes.
like no. These cannibals and these psychopaths, they were all murdering kids in this place the whole time. And
Yes.
then when they were about to get caught, they committed a satanic death
Yes.
ritual that works. So
Yes.
Satan is real, confirmed, and
Huh.
that is the overall presence in this town. Who is so you know what? It definitely makes sense that like that this is
Yes.
their offering to Satan that they have to do to keep it at bay. So like I it definitely works a lot better than this like non-committal straddling the line between fantastical horror and straight horror that Five Nights at
Yes.
Freddy's
Yes.
botched. So
And to bring in, as we just kind of like, I guess, have callbacks to lots of the scholarship we brought in over the years, to refer back to probably our number one scholarly framework, which is the affirmative versus disaffirmative. This is a film I might be willing to say is like neither, because I'm not sure it cares, right? Like technically it's both, right? Because the like Satanists who murder children is definitely outside threats, but also it's the town, right? So it's definitely also disaffirmative because the town is in on it. But almost more than that, it's just not even trying, right? It's not even trying to make a statement about what the source of horror is. And that was a big miss for Five Nights at Freddy's because they were just so emphatically trying to have like, but don't worry, at the end of the day, life can still
mhm,
be good, humans can still be good. And that's never, for all we know, the janitor murders the girl like in 10 minutes later, and that wouldn't
mhm.
feel out of character, and it also would feel out of character at the same time, right? Because there's just so little that this film is trying to force on us in terms of an agenda.
Yeah, I would posit that maybe there is like a third thing that is horror can be. It's either affirmative, disaffirmative, or absurdist horror like this,
Yes.
in which it just like rejects all the societal conventions because everything is broken, which I think really falls into like that philosophical framework of absurdism, which is definitely the realm that this film is playing at and
Yes.
gesturing
Yes.
to in its best moments.
Yes. One of the things that comes up a lot in discussions of the carnival is that images, this is again a quote from him, all the images of carnival are dualistic. They unite within themselves both poles of change and crisis, birth and
Mm.
death, blessing and curse, praise and abuse, youth and old age, top and bottom, face and backside, stupidity and wisdom. And I think here's another really interesting way in which we can make meaning of this weird relationship that does form between the janitor and the girl whose name I can't remember. What is her name?
Live.
Perfect, which I guess is a little on the nose there. So Liv and the janitor are set up in this way to represent these sort of two extremes, right? He's a someone that has only been temporarily trapped in this town. She's someone that's been trapped in this town for a long time. He has no one that cares for her. She has lots of people that care for her. He really has a mission, which is to clean, which is an absurd mission. She really
Mhm.
has a mission, which is to try to save a human, which is a much more lofty sort of mission. And there's just so many times that this film, even I think in some of the decisions about what our animatronics look like and what our puppets look like, that the film is really consciously giving us some parallels of like, here's how we should see it, especially the chameleon, right? Where when she's trying to convince the guy that she kills that she's the good one of the bunch, right? That she was sort of like forced against her will to do this. Even in there, right? We kind of see, because there's this moment where you're like, I don't know, maybe she isn't as monstrous as the others. She's certainly scary looking, and I think it just does a good job of kind of playing with those dual images.
Another good choice, I think, that really does make the film kind of pop is having Nick Cage, I think, as this silent figure too.
Oh my
I
gosh,
think
yes.
if I remember from our conversations about Five Nights at Freddy's, one of our big problems was just how chatty everybody was and like the dialogue in that film, and so you really do eliminate that problem when you just have your central character remain mute for the majority of the film. And in that Entertainment Weekly piece, Parsons revealed that originally was going to have one line.
Oh,
Do you
interesting. What was it?
do
Do
you
you
want
know?
do I do know
I do.
it
I
was going
do.
to be "Come at me, bro," as he and Willy are staring at
Ah,
each other.
I'm so glad
But
that line wasn't in there.
Lewis says, I was really struggling with that. You got to make it an iconic line if he's going to say one line in the movie. We go back and forth, and I'd always picture something like what Bruce Campbell says in The Evil Dead, groovy. It's got to be
Right.
something like that. But what is it? Nick and I decided no lines. And
Yes, certainly it's not come at me, bro. Right?
it's
Like that
certainly not that.
is,
Yeah.
like I could maybe something like you can't weasel your way out of this. Like there are options, but it does not come at me, bro. And I'm glad. I think that, it makes sense that it doesn't make sense that he's quiet the whole time. I think it makes sense in this film world, that he's not going to talk at all rather than have a throwaway line. And again, because it's Cage, I never felt like I was missing out on hearing from the janitor, because the dance scene is so clear. His fight scenes, even when he's just cleaning, he's so expressive in that role. Even when his expression is that he's just sort of like going through the motions, we didn't need to ever hear from him.
We didn't. So I guess maybe treading into some of the other like non
Yeah,
Nick Cage moments of the film, like
right, because
well,
if you're listening to this episode so far, you're probably like, but it sounds like you really like the film. But there's a lot that is harder to swallow, and it's most of the
most of
non-Nick
the
Cage elements.
and I guess it starts kind of from an interesting place where we just like meet Liv, who is like I guess our final girl for the
Ugh,
flick,
yeah.
of sorts. I mean, and I guess I had not caught that name, but that is a dumb pun.
Yeah.
But it starts in interesting places. She's just like literally about to set fire to Willy's Wonderland, about to strike the match. But then quickly she like gets reprimanded by her cop guardian mom, who then like chains her to the radiator or something in their house. And then
Yes. And then
it
when her
quick
friends show up, it's like, oh yeah, this is just what happens on a normal Tuesday. Like they didn't seem very surprised that she was chained to a radiator. But I do want to give a shout out to, there are a couple of character actors in here, including the woman who plays Liv's guardian, who's played by
oh
Beth
yes,
Grant.
Beth
And
Grant.
she's really great anytime she's in stuff, especially when she's in stuff that kind of leans into her personality. Rick writes as Tex, and even Chris Warner as Jed. Like I think that those three actors were well chosen. They do a good job of being exactly the character they were asked to be. I actually just it's all the teenagers that I can't stand.
Totally. I just really the most lazy part of the movie, like
Yes.
you, and I do mean that in all aspects. I want to like those sequences are shot so much worse than the rest of the movie.
Yes.
They are lit much worse, and although the film is very poorly color graded, that is a big, large critique of the look. I
Yes.
hate the oversaturation that they've got on the whole majority of the movie.
Yeah.
It just looks terrible. I'm there's got to be better. There's got to be better like raw footage of this available, and I think they maybe just should have like honed it down on the color grading. But the sequences with the teenagers, I think, are shot worse. The acting just like goes way down from what the level of camp and like seriousness
Hmm.
that and gravitas that Cage is bringing to the film, and they're just like such thinly written stereotypes, and not in a way that is clever or commenting on them.
No.
They're just there, like.
Yes. And it's as though this was the point in the film where they just said, okay, but who are the characters we usually have in a horror film that we can just cut out of another text and put into this one? And to such a degree that it not only didn't always make sense, it felt like they built these elaborate relationships between characters that were never explored other than to just be confusing, right? It was very clear that like multiple of the boys liked Liv and that there was some tension between, the steamy hunk and the best friend, but you can't do that effectively when you don't have good lines, you don't have
Mhm.
particularly good acting, you don't have a lot of screen time. And where I have forgiven that in the past for some of our other films, I just couldn't forgive it because I think you're right. The problem is that juxtaposed against the scenes in Willy's Wonderland, and particularly the scenes with Nicolas Cage, it was clearly unforgivable because they could have done better, right? I
It,
knew they could do better because I saw it in other scenes.
and it just really makes, I know that like the movie is like what, an hour 28 minutes long, 88
Yeah.
minutes.
Hmm.
So it's already not a lengthy film, but
Right.
I did enjoy the Tex McAdoo character and Jed Love, the
Yes.
truck driving character or whatever, and even the sheriff and like her like weird quirky deputy
Oh,
were kind of
yes.
funny
Yes.
too. They had some
Yes.
weird scenes like when they're just like waiting for the phone call in the office or driving
Yes.
around. So like I think if you had just made, if like the film had just focused on those elements rather than, I just didn't feel any need for this like teen plot in here. And it honestly didn't feel like the script felt like there was a real need for it. It felt
No.
like shoved into it. Because we literally just go totally to this other part of town in order
Yes.
to introduce these teenagers and then bring them back over to Willy's Wonderland because they all have some like dumb, convoluted connection to the things.
Yeah, so we needed people to kill, right? We needed people for Willy and crew to destroy. And
Yeah.
it wasn't going to be obviously the janitor. And if it's closed, then they have written themselves into a situation where they have to figure out how do we get people into a closed building, particularly if possible, quote, kids. And this was the solution that they came up with. But the problem is that it wasn't a very good solution.
Yeah. And I mean, whatever, it doesn't matter. They're just cannon fodder. And that's fine. It does work for the most part when,
Sure.
because I don't care about them.
Right.
But it does make for a substantially less compelling movie and a much less satisfying overall package. Particularly again when like there is a lot of really good stuff in this flick that works.
And I think they could have leaned into the fact we didn't care about the teens to make the death scenes either even more elaborate or more amusing and absurd. But instead it was pretty by the books, right? It was,
Mhm,
oh, well, we better be having a couple people that are in the middle of having sex because what's a horror movie without a sex death scene?
mhm.
Or we should have, one person that's not going to fight back. Like it just felt like they had gone through a list of what they identified as horror movie moves and put those in instead of seeing this as an opportunity to say, you don't care at all about these characters. So we're just going to destroy them in the most excitingly, profoundly absurd way possible. And
And
it just felt like you said, it was the laziest part of the film in a way,
and
but it had too much screen time to be the laziest part.
agreed. And because I think like again, yeah, if you maybe had lean, I think the problem too is like all of the male characters are just so generically like jockey.
Yes.
And then
Yes.
there's only really the one other character besides female character besides Liv, who is
Yes.
basically just there to have sex and die,
Yes.
unfortunately. And so I think if you had like leaned into more of these outrageous stereotypes of these characters, like something you maybe get in like the Friday the 13th franchise
Yes.
or Nightmare, something like that, maybe you could have commented on it or like pick some it's just lacking. It's just really, it is just a really lacking element.
I would have enjoyed seeing something that was like a little bit more where they are trying to be like Home Alone style, crafting their own weapons and stuff. And then they just horribly fail because that's not how you can actually survive. Like I think there are fun things they could have done with those characters where they could have kept them largely stock, and it would have been building the absurdity rather than dragging the film down a little bit. There are also just a few things, I think, particularly that opening scene with the Camaro, that did feel like even in an 88-minute movie were a couple minutes too long. Most of them are with the teens, but I do think that we didn't need we didn't really need hardly any of the things happening outside Willy's Wonderland.
Yeah, and I think that is something that this film has in common with Five Nights at Freddy's, is like this concept. If you're gonna do it, it really, like, in the games you do not get anything out really
Right.
outside of the place at all. You are just pretty much dropped in there. You know that you're the janitor. You know you've got to do this assignment. And anytime, so I think anytime in the cinematic version outside of that, like their attempt to frame it or drop you into this or whatever, like ease you into the world, it's unnecessary.
It really is. But I don't know if I've ever seen a film that doesn't feel the need to offer some sort of context outside the like confined space of and not just like in this case Willy's Wonderland, but like I'm trying to think through, and I feel like most horror movies force you to experience something that's outside, right? Either they're moving into that new house and we have to see them before they've moved in so that we can have this like establishment of the status quo, or we see them hiking into the camp or whatever it might be. And I don't know if it's because horror, in order for something to be horrific, we have to know that whatever we're experiencing in this place is not being experienced outside this place. Because like we could be like, well, maybe every Willy's Wonderland is equally haunted, and this is happening everywhere. And so I don't know if it's like an instinct to try to show us just how off this place is, but it happens all the time. Films are always trying to give us these like, but wait, here's what it's like in the outside world. And it just doesn't work in a film like Willy's Wonderland.
Yeah, I think again, if the film wants to, it includes these more traditional like genre elements, the dropping in, the disruption of status quo, the teenagey characters that do juxtaposed against the carnivalesque and the absurdist elements that really do work about the film. And so I think it's whenever the film is playing it safe are the parts that work the least about it, because at its best, and this is probably true of most Nick Cage's stuff, it's like when it's like it's so dumb, but you're taking it so seriously,
Yes.
rather than trying to be like, no, we're a serious horror film. Take it seriously. Like
Yes.
we've got these establishing shots. Look at this money we have to shoot this Chimera sequence. You're like,
Yes.
okay, fair enough, but like it doesn't beat the just like unadulterated fun of just seeing Nick Cage just like playing pinball and crushing energy drinks.
Yeah,
Like,
and he does
just
such a good job
yeah.
in
So
those scenes. Yeah.
yeah. Is there anything else you want to be sure we touch on?
Yeah, there's two other things. So one of the other things that Bakhtin talks about is he says deeply ambivalent also is the image of fire. In Carnival, it is a fire that it simultaneously destroys and renews the world. So again, this becomes a way to make sense of, I think, the good parts of Willy's Wonderland, because it is, I'm sure they did not mean for it to, but it is kind of ticking through a lot of the components and elements of the carnivalesque. But I also want to say, and this is again compliment to Nicolas Cage's performance. So that being the thesis, right, is that if it's got him in it, those parts are good. But and again, I think it's something that only he could have pulled off. I was pleased by the total lack of creepiness of this older male character and younger female character. We've talked a lot in horror about how there's often this idea of like the final girl being protected or taken care of by the wise older man. And we've also talked about the fact that sometimes it has felt really wholesome, but a lot of times it's felt icky. And not enough that like we could be like, oh, this is definitely a creepy bad news bears relationship, but just close enough that you're like, this doesn't feel like it's supposed to be nearly as affirmative as it is supposed to be. And I never got that sensation, even at the end, right? When, of course, Liv is riding off into the sunset or sunrise with the janitor, and he offers her, the drink. Like you just get the sense that this is going to be a super platonic relationship as they do whatever it is that they do. And I was really pleased by that because I didn't need there to be this creepy, like she had a crush on him or any of that I'm a little surprised they didn't end up doing because of how easily the teenage characters were written. So I think that's a really good part about this film that also makes it a lot easier to watch because you're not creeped out the whole time.
Good job, Willy's Wonderland. No pedophilia.
Yay! Which is not something that is always true in horror. So,
That is true.
huzzah. Yeah, so I think, I'm glad I saw it, especially because it is kind of talked about as a cult classic. I'm glad that I can add this to the list of films of Nicolas Cage that I've seen happily.
And it's a good one from him. It's like a good.
It is.
He. It's a very good turn by
Oh my
Cage. So
gosh, it
like,
is.
I for all the like larger problems with like some of the script and the production of the film and whatnot, but he really does. He's committed to it, and I think if you're a fan of his or like campy absurdist horror, you should check it
Yeah.
out at least once. It might end up really being your cup of tea because like the filmmaker, that Lewis and Parsons both say that this is meant to be kind of laughed at. You're not really supposed to take it that
Good.
seriously. So maybe if you go in with that kind of mindset, you're really not expecting to enjoy the teenage characters or get anything out of that, or maybe that's when you I don't know what you do. I don't know what you do with your
Mhm.
life. Maybe you chug a beer or something then
Yeah,
during those
drink your own
scenes.
energy
Drink
drink.
your
Yeah.
own energy drink
And
to
you
get through
said
those.
that there's somewhere between rumors and hopes that there will be a sequel.
I mean, they both Lewis and Parsons have confirmed that they are down for sequels, and there has been confirmation that there are conversations about a sequel. So that means nothing in
Yeah.
Hollywood speak.
Yeah.
But you want? I mean, they offered a couple of pitches at the end of that Entertainment Weekly
Okay.
in our article. So Lewis was like, maybe you could do a John Carpenter Assault on Precinct 13 style, or the janitor gets caught in jails and the electronics are coming for him. It's a big
Mm,
jail fight. Or maybe it's a Mad Max vibe where he's in the car
mm,
driving and he's got some homemade weapons. There's so much cool stuff you could do. So Parson kind of pushes back a little bit and he says, like, the big challenge for him is like, how do you tell the same joke twice? Which I think
mm.
is fair. He's like, he goes on to say, and I quote, does he take on somebody new, a new bad guy, a new monster? Well, yes, that would be great. But then what about the stars of the show? Which are the animatronics? You gotta bring them back. My wife pitched a team up where he and Willy have to fight a new foe together. I have an idea, but it's only an idea at this stage.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, so I would watch a sequel as long as it had Nicolas Cage in it, right? I think the moment that they, as often happens, right, when the
Mm.
sequel doesn't have the main cast return, like I wouldn't watch it even if it had the actress who was living it. I certainly would. It has to be Nick Cage. But the truth is that this film did not do very well financially.
No, it certainly did not. I think it had a lot of things working against it. It was released February 2021,
That
which
was a dark time.
is a dark time. COVID was pretty rampant then, in a very like limited theatrical release while simultaneously being released on video on demand. So we will never know the numbers that it gets from that. They do not have to release those, but we do know that its theatrical total was
Mm,
$418,286, which is not great, particularly against a budget of $5 million. Now, I imagine a big chunk of that 5 million went to pay Nick Cage's salary.
I'd
Um,
imagine.
I but so I mean, maybe
But
if
even
they
then, right, that's not very much. I mean, he clearly was doing this project more because it tickled his fancy than to make, a big paycheck.
for sure, I think it's clearly definitely a labor of love from him,
Yeah.
and I would imagine maybe he took a reduction, so maybe he would be willing to. Again, I don't know. We don't know what their video on demand sales were. Maybe it really has like popped off on streaming. Again, I hear a lot of people talk about this movie. They've seen
Hmm.
this. So like
Yes.
when I was telling people I was watching this, they were like, "Oh, that's a good one. I've seen that one." So I think people have checked it out, maybe at home
I would
and
also be
whatnot.
curious to
So
know if the people who have really high opinions of it and the sort of people who have a cult following to it are people who saw it in 2021, because there's an element of carnival laughter that is about actually like laughing in reaction to the crises of the world. And I wonder if this is just a film that, like, if you saw it in 2021, it was the thing you needed, right? Like, you needed to see his amazing dance, his amazing battles, because that was all that we could make have meaning in February of 21. So it'd be very interesting to sort of do a study of how many people that really adhere to this were because they needed to be in a carnivalesque moment themselves.
I mean, both Lewis and Parson talk about that in that Entertainment Weekly interview. You should please do yourself a favor. We'll link to that in the description of this. You should definitely give a read to that interview, because I don't know if I would watch another film. I don't know. I maybe depends on what sequel premise they end up going with, but I definitely would love to grab a beer with these guys. They seem really cool. They give a great interview, and seems like they had a lot of fun making the film. Yeah, I know if they can get Frankenstein Willy to come back and maybe team up with Nick Cage to fight something bigger and stupider, you know what? Maybe I'm back in.
That is our discussion of Willy's Wonderland and sort of the conclusion of our arc that happened more by happenstance than anything, of what amusement parks and weird little places where kids go to be kids / be preyed upon. That sort of ends our arc of those texts, although I'm always happy to return to those places. And as you may know from listening, we finally finished our Friday the 13th franchise discussion after what felt like years, but was at least 1 year. And we are ready to move on to yet another exciting franchise that will be, I think, filled with equal highs and lows. Toni, what's coming next?
We are diving in to the Leprechaun franchise. We're going to be starting with 1993's Leprechaun, starring Warwick Davis. I've never seen these films before. Apparently Jennifer Aniston is also in this movie too.
Yes, she is. Yes.
So I am just fascinated and intrigued with how these movies got, unintended, green lit, and just delighted at the concept of horror, holiday horror. So
yes, I have seen most of. I'm pretty sure I stopped watching at some point some of the original Leprechaun, but I can't wait to be able to say that I've seen some of the places we're going to go on our Leprechaun journey, which was really what made us decide, is that every new title became increasingly absurd. And so I'm excited to see where we are going as we move from a farm to space to the hood. So there's good times ahead for us, which is really exciting. So we hope that you will watch or rewatch Leprechaun. And we want to always thank Jackson O'Brien for editing this podcast.
Indeed.
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
that makes Jackson. A huge difference.
You make us sound so much smarter than we are.
Oh my gosh, yes you do. So thank you so much. And to those of you listening and those of you who've been listening, thank you so much for listening to our nightmares.
And have a spooktacular day.